2 Delta Force snipers requested permission to be dropped into a hostile city block surrounded by thousands of armed fighters. They were told no. They asked again. Denied. They knew what would happen if they went. They knew the pilot trapped in the wreckage below them had minutes, maybe less. They asked a third time. Permission was granted. Master Sergeant Gary Gordon and Sergeant First Class Randy Shughart climbed out of their helicopter and descended into what they both understood was certain death. This was October 3, 1993. Mogadishu, Somalia. What began as a 60-minute snatch-and-grab operation had already collapsed into chaos. 2 Black Hawks down, American soldiers scattered across a hostile city, and the longest sustained ground combat involving United States forces since Vietnam was just beginning. Before the sun rose on October 4th, 19 Americans would be dead, and the images broadcast from Mogadishu would change American foreign policy for a generation. Somalia did not collapse overnight. The fracture began in 1988 when internal opposition to Mohamed Syed Barre's dictatorship erupted into full-scale civil war. Barre had ruled since 1969, initially aligned with the Soviet Union before pivoting to the West after the Ogaden War. That realignment flooded Somalia with billions of dollars in weapons, assault rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine guns. An arsenal built to fight proxy wars during the Cold War, now scattered across a nation with no functioning government. When Barre fell in January 1991, the rebel coalition shattered along sub-clan lines. No central authority formed. The nation fractured into territories controlled by warlords who used food as a weapon, hijacking international aid to fund militias and starve rival clans into submission. For ordinary Somalis, geopolitics meant nothing. What mattered was survival. Armed men controlled food depots. Children learned early which streets belonged to which clan, which neighborhoods meant death for outsiders. Aid trucks did not arrive as relief. They arrived as prizes to be fought over, cargo that could feed your family or arm your militia. By the time American troops landed, Somalia was not simply starving. It was armed, fractured, and accustomed to violence as the only reliable currency in a failed state. By 1992, 300,000 Somalis had died from starvation. Another 1.5 million suffered from severe malnutrition. The world was watching a nation cannibalize itself. President George Bush authorized military intervention in December 1992. Operation Restore Hope deployed 28,000 American troops under a mandate that allowed the use of force to secure humanitarian access. The mission worked because the leadership, Marine Lieutenant General Robert Johnston and Ambassador Robert Oakley, took a diplomatic approach, persuading warlords to open roads and store their armed pickup trucks, called technicals, in designated compounds. They understood that military force alone could not solve what was fundamentally a political crisis. Aid reached the starving. The famine began to recede. Soldiers distributed food. Children smiled at American troops. For a brief moment, it seemed the intervention might actually succeed. Then the mission changed. In March 1993, control transferred to the United Nations. The new operation had an expanded mandate: nation building, restoration of government institutions, forced disarmament of clan militias. The mission had evolved from feeding the hungry to restructuring an entire society. This was no longer peacekeeping. It was peace enforcement. And Mohamed Farrah Aidid, leader of the Somali National Alliance, saw it as an existential threat. June 5, 1993. 24 Pakistani soldiers were inspecting a Somali National Alliance radio station in Mogadishu when they were ambushed. The attack was coordinated, brutal, and decisive. All 24 were killed. Some bodies were mutilated, dragged through the streets in a display meant to send a message. The United Nations Security Council responded with Resolution 837, authorizing military action against those responsible. But the resolution went further. It personalized the conflict, transforming a peacekeeping mission into a manhunt for Mohamed Farrah Aidid himself. Aidid was not a typical warlord. He was a former general, Soviet-trained, tactically sophisticated. He understood military operations and political leverage. More importantly, he understood how to fight an enemy with superior technology. When the UN made him the target, he became a symbol of resistance against foreign intervention, rallying nationalist sentiment even among Somalis who had previously opposed him. The shift was profound. What had been a humanitarian mission with broad Somali support transformed into something that resembled an occupation. Aid workers noticed it first, the way people who had welcomed them now watched with suspicion, the way conversations stopped when UN vehicles passed. On July 12, 1993, the United States executed what became known as the Abdi House Raid. Cobra helicopters struck a building where Haber Gitter clan elders were meeting, killing over 70 Somalis. Intelligence suggested the meeting included Aidid's senior leadership. What the intelligence did not fully account for was that moderate elders seeking peaceful resolution were also present. The raid meant to decapitate the leadership instead galvanized opposition. Somalis who had been neutral or supportive of UN presence now viewed the intervention as aggression. Children who had waved at American soldiers began throwing rocks. The city was turning hostile. American casualties began mounting. In August, 4 United States military policemen were killed by remote-detonated landmines. The attackers used command wires hidden in rubble, triggering explosives as convoys passed. Simple tactics, devastating results. Each casualty hardened American resolve to capture Aidid, and each attempt to capture Aidid generated more Somali resistance. The cycle was accelerating. President Bill Clinton authorized the deployment of a hunter force. Major General William F. Garrison received orders to deploy to Mogadishu with a singular objective: capture Mohamed Farrah Aidid and his senior leadership. Garrison was a career Special Operations officer, a Vietnam veteran, and the commander of Joint Special Operations Command. He understood precision raids. He understood high-risk operations. What he was about to encounter was something different. Not a conventional military target, but a ghost moving through a hostile city where every resident was a potential informant or combatant. Task Force Ranger was built from 441 elite operators, drawn from multiple units. C Squadron from 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta Force, would serve as the assault element, the operators who breached doors and captured high-value targets. These were men selected from already elite units, put through selection courses that broke most candidates, trained to operate in environments where mistakes measured in inches meant death. B Company from 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment would establish blocking positions, cordons preventing enemy reinforcement or escape. The Rangers were younger, less experienced than Delta, but ferociously trained and disciplined. 1st Battalion, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, provided MH-60 Black Hawks and AH-6 and MH-6 Little Birds for insertion and extraction. These pilots flew missions other aviators considered impossible. 24th Special Tactics Squadron contributed combat search and rescue specialists who specialized in recovering downed aircrews under fire. SEAL Team 6 provided reconnaissance support, though their maritime expertise would prove less relevant in landlocked urban combat. They arrived at Mogadishu Airport in late August and immediately began operations. The base was austere, tents, temporary structures, minimal amenities. The heat was oppressive, reaching over 100 degrees during the day. Dust covered everything. But the soldiers did not complain. They were there to do a job. Between late August and late September, Task Force Ranger conducted 6 raids. Each followed an identical pattern. Helicopters fast-roped Delta operators onto target buildings, while Rangers established four-corner blocking positions at surrounding intersections. The ground convoy, Humvees and 5-ton trucks would arrive to extract prisoners and personnel. Speed was everything. Get in, grab the targets, get out before the city could react. It worked every single time. On September 21st, they captured Osman Ato, Aidid's chief financier, in broad daylight. Clean, surgical, successful. The intelligence network was providing solid information. The tactics were proven. Confidence was building. But success created a hidden vulnerability. Each raid taught the Somali National Alliance how Task Force Ranger operated. They learned flight patterns. Helicopters came from the same direction, followed similar routes. They identified blocking position templates, 4 corners, same setup every time. They observed helicopter insertion techniques, the telltale signature of Black Hawks hovering, ropes deploying. And they began preparing countermeasures, stockpiling rocket-propelled grenades at strategic locations, rehearsing ambush positions, teaching fighters to aim for helicopter tail rotors. The hunter force was being studied by prey that was learning to hunt back. The intelligence came in Sunday afternoon. Omar Salad Elmi and Mohamed Hassan Awale, 2 of Aidid's key political advisors, were confirmed meeting at a residence near the Olympic Hotel in central Mogadishu. These were not military commanders but political operatives, the men who shaped strategy and maintained clan alliances. Capturing them would be a significant blow to Aidid's organization. The location was deep in the Black Sea district, a dense urban slum that served as the primary stronghold for the Haber-Gitter clan. The terrain was not favorable. Narrow streets barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Adobe and corrugated metal structures stacked close together, creating a vertical maze where every window and rooftop could hide a shooter. A labyrinth with limited sightlines and countless ambush positions. But the intelligence was solid. Multiple sources confirmed. The targets were there now. Major General Garrison faced a decision. Wait for a better opportunity, possibly days or weeks away, or act on current intelligence while it was still valid. He chose action. Estimated duration, 1 hour. At 15:32, the force launched. 19 aircraft, 12 vehicles, 160 personnel. Soldiers performed final equipment checks, tightened straps, chambered rounds. Some wrote quick letters home just in case. Most simply focused on the mission ahead, running through mental rehearsals of room clearing procedures, extraction protocols, rules of engagement. The helicopters lifted off from the airport, banking toward the city center. Below them, Mogadishu sprawled, a maze of streets and structures baking under the afternoon sun. None of them knew what the next 18 hours would bring. The assault force reached the target at 15:42. 4 MH-60 Black Hawks hovered above the building, rotors creating massive downwash that kicked up dust and debris. Delta operators prepared fast ropes, checking gloves, positioning themselves in the doorways. Rangers moved toward designated intersections, weapons ready, scanning for threats. The operation was proceeding exactly as rehearsed dozens of times before. Then Private First Class Todd Blackburn fell. He was 19 years old, positioned on a fast rope approximately 70 feet above the street. Accounts vary on exactly what happened, whether his grip failed, whether the rope twisted, whether equipment malfunctioned. What is certain is that he fell, striking the pavement head first with catastrophic force. Severe head trauma, unconsciousness, massive bleeding. The ranger medic reached him within seconds, beginning emergency treatment on the street while teammates established a defensive perimeter. The combat lifesavers worked with practiced efficiency, but Blackburn needed immediate evacuation to a medical facility. 3 Humvees were immediately detached to evacuate Blackburn. During the transit back to the airport through increasingly hostile streets, Sergeant Dominic Pilla was killed by small arms fire, a single round that found the gap in his body armor. The mission clock had barely started, 2 casualties already, but at the target building the operation was proceeding. Delta Force operators moved through rooms with the precision of surgeons, shouting commands in Somali, zip-tying hands, pulling prisoners into the street. These were men who had rehearsed room clearing thousands of times, who moved with an economy of motion that looked almost choreographed. By 1602, 24 prisoners had been secured and flex-cuffed, including Omar Salad Elmi and Mohammed Hassan Awale. The mission objectives were achieved. But extraction was delayed. Multiple after-action reviews would later identify confusion between the ground convoy and assault force about movement signals and coordination. Who gives the signal to move? Who confirms the convoy is ready? These procedural questions that seemed trivial in planning became critical in execution. The delay stretched to 20 minutes. It does not sound like much. 20 minutes in a controlled environment is nothing. In Mogadishu, it was enough time for thousands of armed Somalis to converge on the target area. Fighters who had been scattered across the district now moved with coordinated purpose. Militia leaders who had studied previous raids understood exactly what was happening and where the Americans would be most vulnerable. The city was waking up to the presence of the Hunter force, and it was responding with rage. At 1620, Black Hawk Super 61 was struck by a rocket-propelled grenade. The helicopter, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Cliff Walcott and Chief Warrant Officer Donovan Briley, was providing overhead cover, circling the target area to watch for threats and coordinate ground movement. The RPG-7 round hit the tail rotor assembly, the most vulnerable point on the aircraft. The helicopter spun violently, losing all directional control, the pilots fighting instruments that no longer responded. The Black Hawk crashed 4 blocks north of the target building, the impact violent enough to kill both pilots instantly. Major General Garrison, monitoring from the Joint Operations Center at the airport, heard the call that every commander dreads: bird down. Immediate search and rescue protocols were activated. 2 MH-6 Little Birds, small nimble helicopters that could land in confined spaces, touched down near the wreckage within minutes. A 15-man combat search and rescue team, along with additional Delta operators, moved to secure the site and extract any survivors. The ground convoy, which had been preparing to load prisoners and return to base, received new orders: move on foot toward the crash site. The vehicles could not navigate Mogadishu's narrow streets, so the soldiers would have to walk, carrying equipment and prisoners through increasingly hostile territory. Mogadishu is not designed for military operations. Streets that appear navigable on maps become dead ends blocked by buildings. Intersections that look simple become kill zones with overlapping fields of fire. What appeared as a direct route became a nightmare of wrong turns and ambushes. According to multiple operator interviews conducted in the years that followed, the ground convoy relied on directions radioed from a P-3 Orion surveillance aircraft circling overhead. The aircraft had sophisticated cameras and navigation equipment, but translating that bird's-eye view into actionable directions for soldiers on the ground proved nearly impossible. Information relayed through multiple command layers, from the Orion to the Joint Operations Center to convoy leadership to individual vehicle commanders, created delays that cost seconds, and seconds translated into wrong turns, dead-end streets, and mounting casualties. The Somali National Alliance had learned from previous raids. They understood American tactics, American vulnerabilities. They used civilians as shields, mobs of armed and unarmed people creating an environment where American troops faced split-second decisions about threat identification that could prove fatal either way. Shoot too early, kill civilians, and violate rules of engagement. Hesitate too long, die. The convoy was being torn apart. Rocket-propelled grenades struck Humvees, punching through thin armor and killing or wounding occupants. Small arms fire poured from windows, rooftops, alleyways. Militia fighters knew to aim for the gunners exposed in vehicle turrets. Tracer rounds created visible streams of fire converging on American positions. Vehicles became separated, disorganized, drivers making desperate decisions at intersections where every choice seemed wrong. The convoy could not reach the first crash site. The city was actively preventing it. And then came the call every operator dreads. At 1640, Black Hawk Super 64 went down. Chief Warrant Officer Michael Durant's helicopter was struck by an RPG approximately 1 mile southwest of the target area. The aircraft had been flying low to provide suppressive fire for the trapped ground force when the rocket hit. The helicopter spun out of control, the pilots fighting to auto-rotate, to control the descent, to find any open space to crash land. The aircraft impacted in a residential area deep within hostile territory, the force of the crash catastrophic. Task Force Ranger was now fractured. 2 crash sites separated by over a mile, the original target building still secured but under increasing pressure, and a ground convoy lost somewhere in the city taking casualties with each passing minute. Master Sergeant Gary Gordon was observing from Super 62, a Delta Force sniper, years of combat experience, multiple deployments, a professional who understood war at the most visceral level. He watched Super 64 go down. He saw the dust cloud from the impact. He saw the mob forming around the wreckage, hundreds of people converging like blood cells rushing to a wound. Beside him was Sergeant First Class Randy Shughart, another sniper and close friend. Both men had served together for years. They knew each other's capabilities, trusted each other absolutely. They communicated without speaking, reading body language and expressions that conveyed volumes. They both understood what was happening. Michael Durant was alive in that wreckage. The crew chief and door gunners were likely wounded or dead. The crew could not defend themselves effectively. No ground force could reach them in time. The lost convoy was still trying to reach the first crash site. No other helicopters could land in that confined space under fire. That crash site would be overrun within minutes. Gordon keyed his radio and made the request. "Insert us at the crash site." The response was immediate. Denied. Too dangerous. The risk was extreme. 2 men, no matter how skilled, could not hold a position against hundreds of armed fighters in that terrain. Gordon understood the logic. He also understood that without intervention, everyone at that crash site would die or be captured. He asked again. Denied. Third request. Permission granted. Gordon and Shughart were inserted approximately 100 meters from the crash site. The pilot could not get closer. The landing zone was too confined, too exposed. The 2 operators would have to move through hostile territory on foot. They moved through what survivors and other operators would later describe as a dense maze of shanties, narrow paths between adobe structures where visibility was measured in feet, not meters. Every corner could hide an ambush. Every window could conceal a shooter. They moved with weapons ready, scanning continuously, covering each other's movement in practiced choreography developed through years of training and combat. They reached the helicopter and immediately began pulling Michael Durant from the wreckage. 2 other crew members were already dead from the impact. Durant had suffered severe injuries, a broken back, crushed legs, massive facial trauma. He could barely move. Could not effectively fight. He was fading in and out of consciousness. Gordon and Shughart pulled Durant into a defensive position and established a perimeter around the wreckage. They cleared the immediate area, positioned Durant where he had some protection from the aircraft structure, and prepared for what they both knew was coming. The Somali fighters arrived in waves. Not coordinated military assault, but spontaneous mob violence amplified by weapons and rage. The 2 operators held them off with disciplined, accurate fire. Gordon and Shughart were not shooting wildly, but making every round count, selecting targets, controlling their rate of fire to conserve ammunition. But this was not a tactical problem with a tactical solution. This was mathematics. 2 men, limited ammunition, hundreds of attackers who kept coming regardless of casualties. The defensive perimeter began to collapse. Shughart was hit first, the round finding him despite his cover and tactical positioning. Mortally wounded, he continued firing until he physically could not hold his weapon, his body failing but his will refusing to surrender. Gordon moved through the defensive position, retrieving a rifle with the last remaining rounds. He knew exactly what was happening. He knew how this ended. He handed the weapon to Durant, making eye contact with the injured pilot. "Good luck." 2 words that contained everything that could not be said. Then Gordon re-entered the fight with only his sidearm. Gordon was killed shortly afterward, overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The site was overrun. Durant was pulled from the wreckage, beaten by the mob and taken prisoner. He would be held for 11 days, suffering additional torture and deprivation, before his release was finally negotiated. Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart knew the outcome before they volunteered. There was no reinforcement coming, no extraction possible, no tactical scenario where they survived. They made the decision to defend that crew, fully understanding it was a one-way mission. They did it anyway. On May 23, 1994, both men were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first such award since the Vietnam War. Their actions would become legendary within the special operations community, studied and analyzed not as tactical lessons, but as the ultimate expression of the warrior ethos. Approximately 90 Rangers and Delta operators reached the first crash site at Super 61, but they could not advance further. The volume of fire was unrelenting, sustained, seemingly inexhaustible. Rocket-propelled grenades exploded against buildings. Rifle rounds created a constant percussion of impacts. Machine gun fire raked their positions from multiple directions. They established defensive positions in nearby buildings, occupying rooms that offered firing positions and minimal protection. But the structures were not designed for combat. Adobe walls crumbled under sustained fire. Windows offered exposure, not cover. Doors provided access for attackers as much as defenders. The soldiers fought building by building, room by room. Rangers held intersections with disciplined fire control, dropping militia fighters who exposed themselves to shoot. Delta operators moved between positions, coordinating defense, redistributing ammunition, treating wounded. The chain of command remained intact despite chaos, officers and senior non-commissioned officers maintaining tactical control through force of will and professional competence. The ground convoy attempted multiple routes to reach them, but was forced back repeatedly. Vehicles were disabled by rocket-propelled grenades and concentrated small arms fire. Casualties mounted with each attempt. Drivers were killed at the wheel. Gunners were shot from turrets. The convoy became fragmented, separated into isolated groups fighting independent battles for survival. Eventually, after multiple failed attempts, the convoy fought its way back to the airport, leaving the troops at the crash site stranded deep in hostile territory with no immediate way to extract them. Night fell. The soldiers had left night vision equipment at the base to save weight during what was supposed to be a 1-hour mission. Standard operating procedure for quick daylight raids. The decision now meant they were fighting blind, navigating by feel and memory, relying on sound and muzzle flashes to identify threats. Above them, AH-6 Little Bird gunships executed continuous gun runs, expending thousands of rounds to suppress militia fighters and provide covering fire. The pilots flew missions that tested the absolute limits of aircraft endurance and human capability. They flew until their fuel tanks were nearly empty, landed at the airport to refuel and rearm, and returned immediately without rest. Some pilots flew 8 or 9 sorties that night, each one a gauntlet of ground fire and mechanical stress. The trapped soldiers had no heavy weapons beyond what they carried, no armor, no resupply. They rationed ammunition, counting rounds, making every shot purposeful. Water ran out. Food was not a consideration, survival measured in minutes and hours, not meals. They treated wounded in darkness, combat medics working by touch and experience, applying tourniquets and pressure bandages to wounds they could barely see. Men bled out waiting for evacuation that could not come. Others fought on despite injuries that would normally mean immediate medical evacuation. And they waited. The extraction required what the United States had previously declined to request: heavy armor. The political concern had been that tanks and armored personnel carriers would signal escalation and undermine the humanitarian nature of the mission. The optics of American tanks rolling through Mogadishu would contradict the narrative of peacekeeping and nation-building. That decision, made in policy discussions far from combat, now meant American soldiers were trapped in a hostile city with no way to extract them using existing assets. The relief force was assembled from Pakistani M48 tanks and Malaysian Condor armored personnel carriers, reinforced by soldiers from the 10th Mountain Division, who had been providing perimeter security at the airport. The column was massive, over 100 vehicles, slow, heavily armed, and designed for the kind of sustained combat that had been deliberately avoided until necessity made it unavoidable. The convoy fought through the streets toward the first crash site, taking fire from every angle but advancing with overwhelming firepower. The Pakistani tanks absorbed rocket-propelled grenade hits that would have destroyed lighter vehicles. The Malaysian armored personnel carriers provided mobile cover for infantry advancing alongside. The convoy pushed forward through ambushes and roadblocks, the sheer weight and firepower of the formation too massive for militia forces to stop. At 200 on October 4th, they reached the crash site. The trapped soldiers, who had been fighting for over 10 hours, heard the unmistakable sound of tank engines and heavy weapons fire. Relief. But extraction presented its own challenge. The site was confined, vehicles packed tightly in narrow streets, survivors wounded. And the bodies of fallen soldiers had to be loaded quickly while under continuing fire. The task was completed with grim efficiency, operators and rangers working despite exhaustion to ensure no one was left behind. The withdrawal began at 6:30. Dawn was approaching, but the city remained hostile. There was insufficient space inside the armored vehicles for all personnel. The vehicles were already packed with wounded and the bodies of fallen soldiers. Many rangers and some Delta operators had to run alongside the convoy during the withdrawal through hostile streets. This became known as the Mogadishu Mile. It was not literally a mile, but a desperate movement under sustained fire where survival depended on speed and the suppressive firepower of the convoy's heavy weapons. Soldiers ran in full combat gear carrying weapons and equipment, lungs burning, legs cramping, while bullets cracked past and rocket-propelled grenades exploded nearby. The armored vehicles provided cover but could not protect everyone. Soldiers dove for cover behind vehicles when fire intensified, then resumed running when the convoy moved forward. Some did not make it. Additional casualties occurred during the withdrawal, soldiers hit by fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The entire city transformed into a battle space where every window and rooftop concealed potential threats. By the time Task Force Ranger returned to the airport, 19 Americans were dead. Between 73 and 84 were wounded, some catastrophically. 2 Black Hawks had been destroyed in hostile territory. 2 more were damaged and barely flyable. Multiple Humvees and 5-ton trucks were lost, abandoned in the city or destroyed by enemy fire. The mission had captured Omar Salad Elmi and Mohammed Hassan Awale, the stated objectives. But that fact became utterly irrelevant in the aftermath. Somali casualty figures remained deeply contested and essentially unverifiable due to the absence of official records from the Somali National Alliance, the chaotic nature of urban combat, and the difficulty of distinguishing combatants from civilians. in an environment where militia fighters wore no uniforms and operated from within the civilian population. United States military estimates, based on aerial observation and intelligence assessments, ranged from 1,000 to 1,500 killed and 3,000 to 4,000 wounded. These figures were necessarily approximate, extrapolated from observed casualties and known engagement areas. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which had personnel in Mogadishu during and after the battle, reported approximately 200 civilians killed. This figure represented confirmed civilian deaths at medical facilities and known burial sites, but likely underrepresented the total given the difficulty of documenting casualties in an active combat zone. The Somali National Alliance itself claimed 133 killed and 812 wounded, figures that many analysts believe significantly understated actual casualties for political and propaganda purposes. The wide variation reflects the fundamental challenges of casualty accounting in asymmetric urban warfare. What is certain is that Somali casualties vastly exceeded American losses, and that a significant portion of those casualties were civilians caught in crossfire or killed by the indiscriminate violence that characterized much of the 18-hour battle. The political shockwave was immediate and overwhelming. Images of dead American soldiers being dragged through Mogadishu streets were broadcast on television networks worldwide. The footage was graphic, disturbing, impossible to ignore. American viewers watched Somali civilians celebrating over mutilated bodies, saw the face of Michael Durant, beaten, terrified, held captive, broadcast as propaganda. The public response was visceral. This was not what humanitarian intervention was supposed to look like. This was not peacekeeping. This looked like war, and Americans had not been told they were at war in Somalia. President Clinton ordered complete withdrawal by March 31, 1994. The hunt for Mohamed Farrah Aidid was immediately abandoned. He remained free, his status elevated from warlord to folk hero who had defeated American forces. The nation-building mission was terminated without achieving its objectives. Somalia was left in the same chaos that had necessitated intervention in the first place. In May 1994, the Clinton administration issued Presidential Decision Directive 25, a comprehensive policy framework that significantly restricted conditions for United States participation in United Nations peacekeeping operations. Future involvement required demonstration of clear national security interest, precisely defined objectives, explicit exit strategies, and congressional approval for any mission that might involve combat. The term Somalia syndrome entered the political vocabulary, describing American reluctance to intervene in foreign conflicts for fear of another protracted urban battle, with mounting casualties and unclear objectives. This became tragically evident during the 1994 Rwandan genocide when the international community, including the United States, failed to intervene as 800,000 people were systematically murdered over 100 days. Internal documents later revealed that policymakers explicitly referenced Mogadishu when arguing against intervention in Rwanda. The Battle of Mogadishu exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in American military doctrine regarding urban operations against motivated insurgent forces operating within and among civilian populations. The mission relied on speed and surprise to minimize exposure in hostile territory. Both advantages were negated by urban terrain and an enemy that had studied American tactics through 6 previous raids. Mogadishu's narrow alleys and dense structures created a three-dimensional battle space where American technological advantages, air superiority, advanced communications, precision weapons, were diminished or neutralized by the physical environment. Helicopter-borne forces excelled in open terrain where mobility provided tactical advantage. In dense urban terrain, that mobility became vulnerability. The Somali National Alliance employed devastatingly simple but effective tactics. civilian shields that complicated targeting decisions, engineered obstacles using burning tires and debris that channeled American movement into kill zones, coordinated ambushes at choke points where geography limited maneuver options. The loss of 2 Black Hawks was the critical tactical failure that transformed a successful raid into a disaster. According to multiple after-action reviews and operator interviews conducted in the years following the battle, concerns about helicopter vulnerability had been raised, but were not operationally addressed before October 3rd. A 10th Mountain Division helicopter had been shot down using identical tactics, targeting the tail rotor with rocket-propelled grenades to cause loss of control, approximately 1 week before the October 3rd mission. The tactical lessons from that incident were not fully integrated into task. Force Ranger procedures. The strategy of flying daily reconnaissance and conditioning sorties, intended to desensitize Somalis to helicopter presence and gather intelligence on city layout, inadvertently provided militia forces detailed opportunities to analyze flight patterns, identify approach vectors, and position rocket-propelled grenade teams at optimal ambush locations. Communication challenges compounded tactical difficulties. Urban structures created radio-dead zones, interfering with coordination between ground elements and command aircraft. There was insufficient intelligence regarding the level of tactical coordination between different Somali National Alliance sectors and the speed with which militia forces could mass fighters at engagement sites. Air support, while critical to preventing the complete overrun of defensive positions, was limited in scope and capability. The AH-6 Little Bird gunships provided heroic close air support throughout the night, but these light helicopters lacked the payload and loiter time of heavier platforms. AC-130 gunships, which had been specifically requested by Major General Garrison, but denied by Pentagon leadership for political reasons related to escalation concerns, would have provided the heavy, persistent firepower capable of suppressing entire city blocks and breaking up militia concentrations before they could threaten American positions. Mission planning assumed 1-hour duration based on previous successful raids, leading to decisions about equipment loads that proved catastrophic when the operation extended to 18 hours. Soldiers left night vision equipment, extra ammunition, additional water, and individual trauma kits at base to reduce weight for rapid helicopter insertions and extractions. When darkness fell and ammunition ran low, those weight-saving decisions became life-threatening oversights. In training centers across the United States, Mogadishu stopped being a battle and became a warning. Maps were redrawn, scenarios rewritten. Young officers studied grainy footage not as history but as rehearsal, learning where speed fails, where air power cannot save you, and where political hesitation becomes tactical death. The battle became a laboratory for understanding what happens when elite forces face determined enemies in terrain that negates technological advantage. 18 Americans were killed during the October 3rd to 4th battle itself. Sergeant First Class Matt Rieson was killed in a mortar attack on the Task Force Ranger compound on October 6, 1993, bringing the total to 19. Each name represented a family destroyed, a future erased, a story that ended in Mogadishu. Between 73 and 84 Americans were wounded in action, many catastrophically, amputations, traumatic brain injuries, wounds that would require years of surgery and rehabilitation, injuries that would define the rest of their lives. Malaysian forces lost 1 soldier killed and 7 wounded during the relief operation. Pakistani forces lost 1 killed and 2 wounded. Their contribution, providing the heavy armored vehicles that American commanders had declined to request, proved essential to extracting the trapped soldiers. Those Pakistani and Malaysian soldiers died supporting an American operation in a country most of them had never heard of before deployment, fighting because their governments had committed to United Nations peacekeeping, even when the mission had clearly evolved beyond peacekeeping into combat. Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart's families received their Medals of Honor from President Clinton in a White House ceremony on May 23, 1994. The citation from Master Sergeant Gordon read, "Master Sergeant Gordon's extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest standards of military service and reflect great credit upon him, his unit, and the United States Army." The citation for Sergeant First Class Shughart contained nearly identical language, both recognizing actions that transcended normal expectations of duty and courage. Both men were Delta Force operators. Under normal circumstances, their identities and unit affiliations would have remained classified, their service acknowledged only within the insular Special Operations community. The Medal of Honor made them public figures. Their sacrifice became the defining symbol of the battle, the image that humanized a distant conflict for Americans trying to understand what had happened in Mogadishu. The United States Army completely restructured its approach to urban warfare following Mogadishu, transforming tactical failure into doctrinal evolution. The Shughart-Gordon Urban Operations Training Center was established at the Joint Readiness Training Center in Fort Johnson, Louisiana. The facility was named specifically to honor the two Delta Force snipers and to ensure their sacrifice remained central to how the Army prepared soldiers for urban combat. Unlike previous training facilities that focused on force-on-force engagements in open terrain, Shughart-Gordon was designed to replicate the chaotic, high-density environments of the developing world, where most American military operations were increasingly likely to occur. The facility features state-of-the-art recording systems, cameras and microphones that capture every action, every decision, every communication during training, for comprehensive after-action review and analysis. Soldiers move through scenarios that deliberately replicate the challenges of Mogadishu, civilian populations mixed with combatants, complex three-dimensional terrain, communications difficulties, cascading tactical failures that require immediate adaptation. The facility allows battalion-sized task forces to train together, emphasizing the critical integration of light infantry, special operations, and aviation assets in complex, non-linear battle spaces, where conventional military formations and tactics prove inadequate. The lessons learned from Operation Gothic Serpent were codified in Joint Publication 306, Joint Urban Operations, but the transformation went far deeper than published doctrine. It reshaped how the American military thought about operations in cities, how it trained, how it equipped forces, how it integrated capabilities across service branches. The doctrine emphasizes integrated air power, not reliance on single platforms but layered coverage from multiple aircraft types, providing simultaneous support at different altitudes and with different capabilities. This approach was validated during the Second Battle of Fallujah in 2004, where over 20 different aircraft types provided continuous coverage, from high-altitude bombers to low-altitude helicopters, each fulfilling specific roles in a coordinated air-ground operation that bore little resemblance to the isolated helicopter operations in Mogadishu. Modern doctrine also addresses information operations, recognizing that in the age of real-time global media, operational perception can be as strategically significant as kinetic outcomes. The images from Mogadishu shaped public opinion and political decisions more powerfully than any military briefing or casualty report. Future operations would require not just tactical success, but narrative control, understanding that how a battle is perceived can determine whether the mission is judged successful regardless of objective military outcomes. Task Force Rangers' experience reinforced the absolute necessity of joint interoperability, not just the ability of different services to operate together, but the seamless integration of intelligence, operations, and support across organizational boundaries. the National Intelligence Support Team concept, which embedded Central Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, and Defense Intelligence Agency personnel directly with operational units, became standard practice for Joint Special Operations Command missions. Intelligence was no longer something provided to operators, but something generated with them, real-time fusion of collection and action. The battle proved definitively that Special Operations Forces require dedicated heavy support when operating in urban environments, regardless of mission classification or political concerns about escalation. The absence of armored vehicles and heavy fire support platforms was not a minor oversight, but a critical failure that cost lives. Future Special Operations Doctrine would mandate combined arms packages. Light, mobile special operations elements supported by heavy conventional forces capable of providing armor, artillery, and sustained firepower. Mohamed Farrah Aidid was never captured. He died in August 1996 from wounds sustained in factional fighting with rival clan militias, his death barely noticed by the international community that had once made him the most wanted man in Africa. He was killed not by American forces, but by other Somalis in the endless cycle of clan warfare that continued long after international attention moved elsewhere. Somalia remained a failed state. The warlord system persisted. The humanitarian crisis continued, evolving but never resolving. The intervention that began with the noble goal of preventing starvation ended with American forces retreating under fire, leaving behind a nation no closer to stability than when they arrived. If anything, the intervention had made things worse, militarizing the conflict, demonstrating to clan leaders that violence could defeat international intervention, and leaving behind no functioning institutions or framework for peace. The operation intended to stabilize Somalia through decapitation strikes and targeted captures, instead accelerated American withdrawal, and created a template for how asymmetric forces could defeat conventionally superior military powers by inflicting casualties and generating dramatic media coverage that eroded political will. In Mogadishu, the city moved on. New fighters took old positions. New wars replaced old ones. The spot where Super 61 crashed became just another intersection. The buildings where Rangers fought through the night were repaired or collapsed and rebuilt. Life continued in the way it does in places accustomed to violence, where each crisis eventually fades into the background noise of survival. But in American training facilities, two names were carved into concrete and doctrine alike: Gordon, Shughart. Not as symbols of victory, there was no victory to symbolize, but as reminders of cost. What they did at Super 64 did not change the tactical outcome. Mike Durant was captured anyway. The crash site was overrun. Their sacrifice did not prevent disaster or secure victory. By conventional military analysis, their intervention failed to achieve its objective. But they changed how the battle is remembered. They transformed a story of tactical failure and strategic defeat into something else, evidence that courage and selflessness exist even in catastrophe, that individuals can make choices that transcend self-preservation even when the outcome is predetermined, that honor and duty mean something beyond mission success or survival. Years after the battle, a Delta Force operator who had served with Task Force Ranger was asked by a journalist what lesson Mogadishu had taught him. The operator, whose name remains protected by operational security, paused, considering the question, considering the weight of memory and loss. Then he said that the hardest thing in combat is not fighting. It is choosing to go back into the fight when you know what is waiting for you. Gordon and Shughart made that choice. They knew. They requested insertion 3 times, and they knew what the outcome would be. And they went anyway. That is not tactics. That is not training. That is character at a level most people never have to test. That is what it means to be on a team where everyone matters, where you do not leave anyone behind even when logic says they are already lost. That is what it costs. They paid that cost willingly. We study the battle. We learn the tactical lessons. We fix the doctrine, but we remember them, because what they did was not about winning. It was about who we are when everything else is stripped away. And sometimes, that is the only legacy that matters.